Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are diving into a subculture that came out of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. This subculture directly led to the rise of the personal computer. It led to the rise of the whole cyberpunk genre, and it created a revolution which transformed our entire modern society. And today I'm going to discuss some of the early pioneers of this, some of their legendary feats, and some of their stories. These stories are the stories of the early phone phreakers, the early hackers, these forgotten legends who really opened our eyes to the vulnerability of these systems like the telephone system and these early proto-internet systems. These guys were considered the cowboys of this technological era, and they even had these larger-than-life monikers like Captain Crunch and Captain Midnight, and even a guy named Joy Bubbles who was a pioneer in all of this. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's start where we always do, right at the beginning. So let's take a trip back to the 1960s, because this is really where it all gets started. Now, the 1960s is a completely different world than we know it today. We didn't have instant access to all the information on the planet in the palm of our hand. Computers, while they existed in their infancy, they were the size of a room. They were running on punch tape and reel-to-reel mechanisms. They were something that was really only owned and used by big, giant corporations and government entities on these little internal networks, and hell, even getting the damn things to even talk to each other was still kind of a task that was relegated towards the future. And in this era of no computers, the main way to keep in touch with everybody, aside from the mail, was through the telephone. Now, by the 60s, a telephone was a common appearance in most American households. Hell, almost every American household had a telephone at this point. And if you couldn't access a telephone, you could always access a payphone. This was your internet in the 1960s. This was the way you could communicate instantly with somebody anywhere in the world. You did it over the phone line. However, there was one major drawback to the telephone system. The damn thing costs money. And I'm really explaining this part to the younger generation that may be listening. Us older guys, we kind of know what this is all about. But back then, it wasn't like we have cell phone plans today where you pay a flat fee each month and you have unlimited access to whatever you want. Back then, you were billed based on your calls, and your phone bill could vary wildly based on the types of calls you were making, the length of time you were making the calls, who you were making the calls to, and God forbid if it were a long distance call or one of them 900 lines, could you imagine being charged like $1.97 a minute just to talk to somebody? That really adds up very fast. Plus, on top of that, at this time, you have payphones. You can't go anywhere without a quarter or a nickel in your pocket. If you're in an emergency, you ain't got no change on you and you need to use the phone, well then what do? Well, it was in these days when a group of mostly kids, young teenagers, young adults, whatever, they realized that, hey, I can manipulate these phone systems. And they would learn this just by playing around on phones, reverse engineering the phone systems. They would dial around the system on random numbers and listen to random tones, and then they would start to decipher the various tones they were hearing. And then they quickly learned that if they could recreate some of these tones, they could trick the phone system itself into doing whatever it was they wanted to do. And the original reason why they are doing this is because a lot of them were just genuinely interested in the system and they wanted to learn how it worked. But there was another caveat. They quickly learned that by manipulating the system, they could make free calls and unlimited long distance calls anywhere in the world. And making free calls anywhere in the world, that was kind of the ultimate screw you to these big corporate entities like Bell and AT&T, these monopolistic jerk-off corporations. And it all kind of starts with this kid named Joe Ingressia. He's considered the father of telephone phreaking. Later people would give him the moniker Joy Bubbles, but I digress. So Joe was actually this blind dude. However, despite being blind, the guy was a genius, and it was said that he had perfect pitch. He could actually whistle into a phone at 2600 hertz, and this would allow him to make free long distance calls. He also found out at a young age that he could dial phone numbers by clicking the hang up switch rapidly in a certain tapping motion, and that whistling into the phone at certain pitches could activate certain switches in the network, allowing him to do different things. And he would actually get into a little bit of trouble in college for actually doing this and demonstrating it to other students, and actually got suspended for a short time from college for doing it. But it was really him who kicked off the whole phone phreaking kind of craze and that underground scene that would come out in the 70s. And like any kind of underground scene, it kind of developed its own culture and spread around quite quickly. And of course, he wasn't the only one at the time who was interested in it. There were a lot of kids out there, mostly college-age kids, who were just really interested in the phone systems and how the phone systems worked. They were also interested in things like radio and pirate radio, and some of them actually had pirate radio stations. A lot of people were interested in simply just making free calls and how to kind of hijack the telephone system in order to make these free calls. It's kind of a tale that's old as time. If there's a product out there or a service out there that some dick corporation is charging for, people are naturally going to find a way to get that for free. I do it all the time. But it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because while they were manipulating the telephone companies and the phone lines, they were also exposing a lot of flaws in the, I guess you could say, security of these phone companies. And they weren't just really just sitting there just trying to get free calls. They were actually using social engineering to get access into like certain restricted areas at telephone companies. And then they would like go in and steal all their technical manuals. They would call into telephone companies claiming like, hey, we're at the station out here in like Albuquerque and we need this certain number because we have to do some kind of test. And these people working for the phone company, just thinking they're talking to another employee in another city or another state, just give them access to the systems. And that's a technique we actually still see in computer hacking to this day. A lot of computer hacking takes place through social engineering because your weakest link is that person on the other end of the phone or that email who's willing to click on that link or do that test or give you that access or whatever. Now, one of the most famous phone phreakers of all time is a man named John Draper, also known as Captain Crunch. And this guy's led a fascinating life. He was actually a big influence on Steve Wozniak. But I'll get to that later. So John Draper, he was actually the son of a U.S. Air Force engineer, and as a child, he actually built a home radio station from discarded military components. So from a very young age, this is a smart dude. So he's in college, and in 1964, he decides that he's going to go into the Air Force, and they actually station him in Alaska. And while he was up there, he helped his fellow service members make free phone calls home by devising access to a local telephone switchboard. Later in 1967, while he's stationed at Charleston Air Force Station in Maine, he created WChaos, a pirate radio station. However, it quickly was shut down after a local licensed radio station called WDME objected to it and was like, hey, you gotta shut this down. So in 1968, he's honorably discharged from the Air Force as an airman first class, and he moves to Silicon Valley. And he's briefly working for National Semiconductor as an engineering tech, and he's actually working on designs for early cordless telephones. He goes back to college part-time as well, and he ends up working as a disc jockey, and he kind of gets into that whole countercultural lifestyle. So while he's doing this at the time, he's building this pirate radio transmitter, and he broadcasts a telephone number over it to listeners because he was seeking feedback as to how far this transmitter was transmitting. And he gets a call from another pirate radio operator, a man named Danny Tricet, who introduces him to the world of the phone phreaks. So Tricet basically just calls him up and he says, hey, come over to my house. I want you to meet some guys. You might be really interested in what we do. So he's like, okay. And he goes over to the house and he's like, it's pitch black in here. Shouldn't we turn on a light or something? And Tricet is like, we don't need the lights on. Everybody here's blind. And Draper, he's just basically like, okay, well, what do you guys do? And he says, well, we're phone phreaks. We phreak with the phone systems. You know, we use social engineering and different tone frequencies, and we do all kinds of stuff to manipulate the phone systems to do whatever we want. And Draper's just simply like, well, can you make free calls? And they just kind of laugh. They're like, yeah, of course we can make free calls, buddy. You think we're a bunch of idiots? But there's another reason why they ask him to join. They know he has a background in electrical engineering and electronic design. And they ask him if he can build a multi-frequency tone generator which could mimic the tones that the telephone system is listening for, so they can essentially make these free calls and have these like landline parties and stuff. And that was another thing. They would get a hold of like a party line, and there would be like 50 people on this party line from all over the world, and it was kind of like a chat room from the 90s. It was really cool. They also had these guys who knew how to like get into like business systems and use kind of they didn't really have call forwarding back then, but they had this kind of proto system and they could make these calls using that, and then that bill would go to the company. And just really all this cool screw you corporate America kind of stuff, you know? It was really anarchy on the telephones. But Draper's like, yeah, no problem, I can build a multi-frequency tone generator, that's easy. And what he builds is what becomes known in the phone phreaking and hacking lexicon as the infamous blue bots. And the Blue Bots is actually a very simple device. It's actually built out of old telephone components. I think they were like digging them out of dumpsters and stuff from the phone company. Or I don't know, ripping them out of old discontinued payphones or whatever. But basically it just looks like a keypad on a phone sent to the microphone from a telephone. And it can emit these tones, which could be used to basically take over the telephone network. And essentially it would allow them to make free long distance telephone calls, because the tones would activate certain electronic switches which would have different interpretations. So the call could essentially be billed to a different number, or it could be dismissed entirely as an incomplete call. And the Blue Bots really becomes like the most famous device that they would create in order to manipulate this system. However, Captain Crunch would get his moniker from something a little more mundane. So it was actually from Captain Crunch cereal. They were being packaged with this toy whistle that could emit 2600 hertz, and it was Draper who found out that this whistle could emit this signal. And well, what's so important about 2600 hertz? Well, at that frequency, that's the frequency that AT&T long lines used to indicate that the trunk line was available for routing a new call. So essentially it would trick the system into thinking that the call had been hung up. And he said that he would have a lot of fun sometimes. Him and some guys would go into like bus stations or I don't know, airports or train stations, and they walk along that bank of payphones, which were a common occurrence back then. Everywhere you went, there was a long wall filled with payphones. They would just walk by blowing those whistles, and it would disconnect everybody's call. However, this all kind of blows up in 1971. So in that year, a journalist named Ron Rosenbaum, he wrote an article about phone phreaking for Esquire. And this article was kind of an amalgam of various interviews from various phone phreakers, and some including Draper, who didn't really want to be interviewed, but he kind of got roped into this because it really shoots him into celebrity status. However, when this article came out, he was actually furious because he knew that the phone companies would really start cracking down on this activity. And he was actually on a party line reading this article to a bunch of phreakers, and he's kind of giving them the third degree, like, you shouldn't have said this, why are you guys talking about this, it's gonna ruin us all. And he's reading this article out to them, and he's basically telling them, hey look, this is the end, now the feds are gonna be watching this stuff. And he actually gives the following quote about his involvement in it, and it's, I don't do that anymore at all, and if I do it for one reason and one reason only. I'm learning about a system. The phone company is a system. A computer is a system, do you understand? If I do what I do, it's only to explore a system. Computers, systems, that's my bag. The phone company is nothing but a computer. You know, he's essentially saying, look, I'm not some cowboy out there doing this for exploitative reasons. I'm learning about a computer system, essentially. But this article does eventually lead to his notoriety, and it actually leads him to being arrested in 1972 on charges of toll fraud. Now, what's toll fraud? Toll fraud is basically using a communications network in order to either gain money or to use it for free without paying. And to be honest, I will be perfectly blunt here. I love capitalism, but sometimes this stuff just goes too far. I just personally think that if you can exploit a system or something to get something for free, you shouldn't be arrested for it just because corporations are greedy dickbags, but I digress. But his notoriety actually ends up introducing him to a man who would go on to be world famous. Because while attending Berkeley University, a young student named Steve Wozniak would read this article and become fascinated by this guy. And Steve Wozniak actually reached out to him while he was working at the radio station KKUP as an engineer and wanted to get his input on building blue boxes because him and his friend Steve Jobs were interested in building and selling blue boxes. And actually, the two Steves would later go on to have a little incident with the police while operating a blue box at a payphone somewhere in like Southern California because their car had broken down and they didn't have money to pay for a ride. It said that they were sitting there and Jobs had it and he would put it up to the phone and use it, but he'd get scared and hang up. And after a couple attempts of using it, the police actually rolled up on him and was like, well, what do you got here? And they're like, oh, it's a sound synthesizer. And he's like, yeah, well, it sounds out of tune. What's that orange button? Is that what you use to take over the phone lines? And right then they were caught, but it didn't really deter them because we were on the cusp at this point of the personal computer revolution, and it would be led by the likes of Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs, and all these other guys coming out of Berkeley and Silicon Valley who would go on to develop these iconic personal computers. The Apple II, the TRS-80, the Atari's 400 and 800, which personally the Atari 800 is my favorite, but I digress. And this would lead to kind of the next evolution, the next step in what would become computer hacking during this early microcomputer era of the late 70s and early 80s. Of course, early computer hacking during this time, it wasn't really malicious. The term itself just meant that somebody who was messing around with computers. It referred to these young guys coming up who wanted to tinker with computers and push these personal computers to their limits. And in that same kind of mindset of the phone phreakers, they wanted to get access to these early proto-internet type systems and generally just see how they worked and see what they could gain access to. And the current targets during this time were the internal networks of tech companies and colleges. And using some of these same social engineering techniques that phone phreakers would use to gain access to these systems, these early computer hackers would use these techniques to get a hold of passwords and modem numbers. And then they would go in, they would tinker around on the networks. Some people were doing it just for curiosity. Some people were doing it for pranks. And some people were doing it for other nefarious purposes. For example, they would copy source code and they would either use that source code themselves or they would go out and sell it on a black market. A lot of people were getting into these banking systems and these, store systems, any system that would use credit card numbers, and they would copy down hundreds of thousands of credit card numbers. They would get into government systems like government databases and use that to even steal identities sometimes. And it's a crazy Wild West world because they're doing them all from these early 80s computers, like these TRS-80s that they're using at Radio Shack. Or it's like a bunch of college kids in a dorm who get onto the database and manipulate their grades. And they're kind of just doing the same thing that the phone phreakers were doing. They were just pushing the limits to see what they could do, what they could get away with. They were exploiting vulnerabilities in these early systems. And it's kind of crazy to think that they're doing this in a pre-internet age, all on 300 baud modems. And the vast majority of these people, they were literally just doing it just to see if they could do it. And usually they would get into some system of some company and copy a bunch of files just to prove that they were able to do it. And to be honest, the criminal aspect really didn't come along till much later, around the rise of the internet era in the late 80s, early 90s. But there was one man who has a crazy life story, who kind of grew out of this era and became the most famous computer hacker of all time. His name is Kevin Mitnick, and his story reads like a crime novel. And a lot of tropes that we see in the world of hacking via movies and film or whatever actually are derived from some of his adventures. So let's get in his story. So it all starts at the beginning. So Mitnick was born on August 6, 1963 in Van Nuys, California. And the guy was obviously a genius because from an early age, he was into kind of manipulating systems. He kind of got this fascination with things like social engineering and magic and stuff at a very young age. And using social engineering, he actually devised this really clever plan where he was able to ride the bus anywhere in town for free. So he asked this local bus driver who had this ticket punch that he would use to punch people's tickets so they can get the ride to bus, where he could buy one of those ticket punches because he needed it for a school project. And the bus driver was like, yeah, kid, you just go down to this shop here and ask some guy named Lou and he'll sell you the ticket punch, no problem, blah, blah, blah. And Mitnick, he also knew that there were these people that had these punch cards that they would just kind of toss out in the back dumpster behind the bus station. They were unused. So he would get a big old handful of these unused punch cards, and he used his own punch and punch his ticket, and he could ride anywhere for free. So already from a young age, we could see this is a clever kid who's really caught on to the idea of social engineering. And this skill would come to serve him, I guess, well in his life, because he would use these tactics to serve him over and over again throughout his life. So in high school, he was interested in technology, so he became a phone phreaker and a ham radio operator, which seems to be where a lot of these early hackers got their start. And in that same vein, and also being a young teenager, he would use it for some pranksterous purposes. At one point when he's a teenager, he actually, with a couple of friends, gets a hold of this CB radio, and they tap into the network of the local McDonald's, like their drive-through network. And him and his friends, they're basically talking to the customers over this like radio network saying, "Yes, sir, may I take your order? Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have fries." Or things like, "Yes, sir, you are our 100th customer of the day, which means you get $100 right out of the register." Or, "I'm sorry, we don't serve cops here. Oink oink." Which, good on him for giving cops a hard time. Always remember, cops are class traitors. They are the stamping boot of the state on your neck. But I digress. But it's actually around the age of 17 where this pranksterism kind of escalates into, we'll just say, crime. So when he was 17, he and a buddy, they actually targeted to infiltrate a Pacific Bell office. And for those who don't know what Pacific Bell is, it's what AT&T is today. So he just posed as an employee who walked right up to the security guard desk and said, "Hey, I'm this employee, whoever, I want to show my two friends around. Can we go on in?" And I guess he said it with enough confidence or whatever that it freaking worked. The security guard didn't even make him sign in or ask for any ID badges or anything. So him and this guy and his girlfriend, they walk right into the file offices of Pacific Bell, and they steal all these technical manuals about the phone network. And I imagine what they were most likely doing was Xeroxing them and sending them out to all their friends who were fellow phone phreakers and stuff, just so they could satisfy that intellectual curiosity about maybe some of the nuances of the telephone system at the time. Remember, the telephone system at the time is the internet of its day, so it's a fascinating thing. So anything you can learn about it, that was valuable to have. However, what happened next would become a running theme throughout Mitnick's life. He and his buddy would get busted when his buddy's ex-girlfriend, who was with him at the time, snitched and basically ratted him out for the whole thing. And for this, he actually spent 3 months in juvenile detention. However, that brush with the law did not deter him. He had a hacking obsession. So time goes on, he gets his GED, and he lands at this technical school in LA where he meets his first wife. However, his first marriage doesn't go all that well. He actually spends more time basically hacking on his computer than he spends time with his wife. He would actually rent out hotel rooms for days and sit there and do these long hacking sessions. And he was mostly breaking into electronics companies. So one of his favorite targets was the Digital Equipment Corporation, which was a leading computer vendor. And he would spend countless hours hacking around DEC's kind of internal intranet system, because he really wanted access to this source code for this operating system that DEC was creating called VMS. And he says the reason why he wanted this source code was so he can find out its security flaws. So I guess it's an exercise in curiosity and intellectualism. But I always wonder if he wanted it for maybe some kind of other purpose, like monetary gain. Now, he alleged till the day he died that he never actually did anything monetarily with the information that he got a hold of, that it was all for curiosity and kind of that victory of being able to get a hold of it and break into that system. But I guess that's just the difference between him and I. If I had gotten into some company like that through some kind of digital espionage, I'd be out there the next day, selling that to the highest bidder. But that's just me, I guess. Total respect to the guy just for doing it for curiosity's sake. Now, Mitnick, he didn't do this escapade alone. When he took the source code, he was actually doing it with an accomplice named Lenny DeCocco, or DeCiccio, or whatever. I don't know how Italian names work. However, the two of them kind of had a falling out, and it was said to have been over a $150 bet that Lenny had lost to Kevin and refused to pay. So in order to, even the score or get some kind of revenge over this stupid bet, Mitnick actually called Lenny's work posing as an IRS agent and told Lenny's boss that, this guy's guy's wanted for tax crimes. So when Lenny found out that Mitnick was doing this, he was so angry that he became Rat, and he told the feds that they were breaking into DEC to steal this source code. So Lenny, he suits up, he's wearing a freaking wire, and he's recording these future conversations with Mitnick where Mitnick and him are talking about the break-in, and, basically gets him on tape admitting it. So the feds come, they arrest Mitnick for this break-in. Lenny gets off with, I guess, a slap on the wrist because he's a bootlicking traitorous rat. And this being the early 80s and ideas of like computers and these systems still being kind of tied up in the military and the nuclear arsenal system, it kind of gets construed in the media that this guy's a national security threat. The prosecutor on this case, a man named Leon Wieldman, he's actually quoted as saying he can whistle into a telephone and launch a nuclear missile from NORAD. That's an actual quote from this prosecutor in this case. And the judge and the general public, just being basically ignorant of how those systems worked at the time, they ate this hook, line, and sinker. They literally, out of these fears that he was a computer hacker and a phone phreaker and a national security threat, threw him in solitary confinement for 8 months. Which is why I will say until the day I die, the feds are not your friend. I'll be honest, this whole topic has thrown me into like an anarchist rant, but that's just how it is. People who cooperate with the feds are traitors because the feds are not your friends. They're just out there to stamp their boot on your neck. But I digress. So he spends about a year in prison, 8 months of it in solitary confinement, and towards the end of his prison sentence, he starts to suspect that his wife is cheating on him. And he confirms this by literally hacking into her answering machine and finding out that she's having an affair with his best friend named Lewis, who was also another computer hacker, phone phreaker, etc., etc. So after this, he gets out of jail, he divorces his wife, and then he kind of moves on. However, he still has this obsession with hacking. However, he now knows that he needs to tread more carefully. So one of these techniques in his future of treading carefully is he's got to make sure that his phone can't be tracked. So he has this Novatel PTR 825 cell phone. And he realizes if I can change the electronic serial number of this phone, I'll have an untraceable phone. So he goes to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which is where like all the tech nerds go. It's like their mecca. It's where tech companies showcase their newest and greatest computers and innovations and cell phones and video games, and it's just a hell of a time if you're a tech nerd. Of course, it's got nothing on a Psycho Stick show, because that band is friggin' awesome. So he's at CES in Vegas, and he calls Novatel and poses as one of their engineers. And he's on the line with an engineering manager named Kumamoto. And I don't know exactly how the conversation went because I wasn't there, but essentially Kumamoto says that it is possible to change the phone's ESM from the keypad if you have a special chip containing a special version of its firmware. And Mitnick's like, yeah, I knew it. Can you send me some of those chips? I'll give you the address. Just ship them here to the hotel we're staying at because, it's a project we're working on, And Kumamoto ships the chips. He gets the chips and he's good to go. He then, after receiving these chips, he solders one into his phone. And after this, he calls up a local electronics store and he's able to get the electronic serial numbers of some of these recently activated phones. He's then able to clone one of these phones and now he has an untraceable phone. And he gets right back into hacking. But even at this point, the feds are watching him very closely and they're actually trying to set him up. So around this time, his half-brother's ex-girlfriend supposedly introduces him to this super awesome, super secretive hacker named Eric. And Eric was super secretive and they would only talk through an intermediary, and through their conversations, he sounded like a fucking fed. So being suspicious of this guy, Eric, Mitnick decides that he's gonna bait him and set a trap for him in order to find out everything he can find out about this guy. So Mitnick, he has this friend named Dave at Pacific Bell. So they give Eric this number that he can use to contact Mitnick. And when Eric dials in, they reroute the call to Dave's office, and using a caller ID, they're able to basically gain access to his number where he's calling from. And then they're able to start the process of tracking him. So after getting a hold of this phone number, they're able to call Pacific Bell again, posing as a tech, and they're able to gain this guy's address. So they get his address and they find out that it's registered under the name Joseph Joseph Wernell. So then they get access to the call logs from this address, and they find out that from this address are a lot of calls to the Los Angeles branch of the FBI. The dude is a fucking Fed, or a Fed informant, which is just as bad if not worse. But it doesn't end there. He's not satisfied just finding out that this guy's either a Fed or a Fed informant, so he devises an elaborate scheme to obtain Eric's social security number. He poses as a member of the Office of the Inspector General at the Social Security Administration investigating fraud, and he goes like full force into this. Like, he starts learning the names of supervisors and managers, and he starts like mastering the internal dialogue of the Social Security Administration. By the time he's done, everybody at the Social Security Administration is convinced that he works there, and he uses this in order to get a hold of Social Security numbers and birth dates and benefits and earnings, all while trying to track down this Fed conspiracy against him. And it takes him down a few rabbit holes, one involving a dead baby, one involving another computer hacker, and then it all leads to this computer hacker named Justin Tanner Peterson, who is a hacker working with the FBI. So in that moment there, he's got him. He knows for a fact that this guy is a fucking Fed. In the meantime, while this is all going on, security agents from Pacific Bell began wiretapping Mitnick's father's phone. And in a lapse of judgment one time while he was at his father's house, he had used his father's phone line instead of his secure, untraceable cell phone, and the feds were able to nail him. However, as the feds were pursuing Mitnick, Mitnick was also pursuing the feds. So he found out that a bunch of the feds were using the cell phone provider Pactel in Los Angeles. So he infiltrates Pactel's system in order to track their call records and pinpoint their locations. This whole time he's working as like, I don't know, like an IT guy or something for this private investigation firm, and in his office he actually has a police scanner which he would use to actually detect FBI cell phones using software program with numbers linked to this Eric guy. So they're kind of playing this game of cat and mouse with each other. However, Mitnick remains one step ahead. However, in September of 1992, Mitnick's scanner detected the cell phone of FBI Special Agent Kevin McGuire. He quickly cleans up his apartment, ensuring there wasn't any evidence left behind that can link him to anything. And on September 30th of 1992, the FBI are knocking on his door, and he's like, you know what, I'm going to screw with these guys, so he answers it in the nude. Says they were also not pleased to see a box of donuts sitting on the counter, specifically labeled FBI donuts. Apparently calling a fucking Fed a pig is not in good taste, but let's call them what they are, fascists. However, the FBI was pissed because they couldn't find a scrap of evidence in his apartment. Mitnick was just too quick and too smart for him. However, by this time, these close calls with the feds were just getting a little too close for comfort, and Mitnick knew that he just had to disappear. So during this time, he ends up actually conning the BMV into getting a copy of this guy's license. And at this time, there's a warrant out for his arrest, and he actually is at this local print shop. The investigators track him there, and he just bolts out the back door, and now he's a fugitive. So he actually takes on the name of Eric Weiss while he's on the run, and anybody familiar with that name knows that Eric Weiss is the name of Houdini. And I do have an episode on Houdini's life in the future. He is a very fascinating guy who was heavily involved in debunking the fraud of the spiritualist movement in the 1890s, early 1900s. Look out for that episode because that one's going to be awesome. So he's looking around for anybody named Eric Weiss who he can basically steal the identity of. This wasn't really brought up in his story, and I don't think he was ever brought up on charges of this crime, but he's basically committing identity theft a couple of different times throughout this story as he bounces from alias to alias. So in order to get a hold of this identity, he actually infiltrates a credit reporting agency. I don't know if it was TransUnion or Experian or whoever. So he actually uses this credit agency to find a Eric Weiss around his age with a really good credit score. Because if you're going to create a new identity, you might as well have a great credit score. Why not? If you're stealing identities and one of the identities you're using has a 400 credit score, you're not going to get very far in life. He then gets a hold of his contacts at the Social Security Agency who still believe that he's this like inspector general in the fraud division or whatever, and he gets a hold of a social security number, birth dates, benefits, possibly a birth certificate, and he disappears appears as Eric Weiss from Denver, Colorado. He's got a job in the IT department at a law firm where it said that he would work diligently throughout the day and hack all night long because he never lost that thrill of hacking. And he said his biggest thrills came from hacking the great tech firms out there that had the toughest security to crack. That was kind of the thrill. But he was also hacking at this time for another purpose, so he had his sights set on Motorola's coolest phone at the time. It was the MicroTac Ultralight. He wanted the phone's source code, and he wanted to understand how the phone's software worked in order to change the electronic security number, just like he did on his Novatel phone. And to be honest, I get it. Motorola phones were awesome. They were like the cell phone to have up until like the 2010s. But he just wanted the newest, upgradable phone that he could basically continue using as a spoofed phone. And he wanted that source code. He was just all about that source code sometimes. And like I said, again, I think he wanted it just to have it, the intellectual curiosity, whatever, because it's not like he got his hands on it and then went over to I don't know, Sony or whatever and said, hey, do you want this source code for this new phone? He never did anything like that. So he gets a hold of Motorola and he's posing as Rick from the R&D team in Illinois. And he gets a hold of the assistant to the vice president of research and development, a woman named Pam. And he says, look, I know Pam's on vacation, but she was supposed to send me the source code for the MicroTac Ultra Lite. However, I haven't received it yet. Can I get the newest and latest version of the source code? I need it immediately. And this young assistant to the VP of R&D literally hands him Motorola's most protected trade secret at the time. However, at the time he does make one small mistake. He actually forgets to ask for the compiler. Now, a compiler is what translates a source code into machine readable code. So without that, you basically just have gibberish that you can't really interpret. So after basically having Motorola give him their most valuable source code on a silver freaking platter, he decides, I wonder if I can do this into Nokia too. So he essentially does the same thing, but he takes it a step further. He gets access to Nokia's entire internal network. He has passwords, security clearances. He actually creates an account for himself. And he has unfettered access to secret projects and new source code and all of this stuff that, somebody who's in industrial espionage would give their left testicle for. He has millions of dollars worth of information just sitting there in front of him. However, once again, he takes it a step too far because he sets his sights on a secretive digital phone that is in the works. It was called the HD760. So he contacts the lead developer of the team that's creating this concept for this phone, a guy named Marku, and he persuades him to share the latest source code. However, at this time, Nokia's kind of beefed up their internal security and they actually block outbound file transfers because, good IT team knows how to protect data. And when this happened, this kind of triggered some internal IT kind of digital alerts and they suspect, hey, there's something fishy here. However, Mitnick, he's convincing this Marku guy to ship the source code via a tape drive to a Nokia office in Florida. And this tape drive was supposed to be picked up via I think it was a FedEx courier at a Ramada Inn. However, Mitnick, he has this gut feeling he doesn't go, at least not alone. He actually sends a buddy to go retrieve the tape. However, that gut feeling was right because the FBI had been alerted to this. And that gut suspicion turned out to be right, so Mitnick actually posed as an FBI agent and said, this is FBI agent Wilson with the FBI. Are you familiar with the situation? And the manager on the premises responded, of course I am. The police have the whole place under surveillance. At that point, Mitnick realized that it was time to disappear and become someone else. He could no longer be Eric Weiss. So he disappears to Seattle, and he says the reason he goes there was because of its tech scene, the great Thai food, and the great coffee. And he takes on the persona of Brian Merrill, who was a baby that died back in the 60s, so it was roughly the same age. And he gets this identity by posing as a private investigator at South Dakota's State Register for Vital Statistics. However, at this point, he knew that he had to be extremely careful about hiding his true identity because his face was plastered on the front page page of the New York Times. They literally labeled him as cyberspace's most wanted. And journalists wrote him up to be like a computer supervillain. Because, by the 1990s, journalists have lost all credibility. They're basically the voice of the state at this point. There's no true journalism anymore. It's all state propaganda and billionaire bootlicking. I defy anybody to show me an honest journalist these days who's not afraid to tell it like it is, but I digress. So the whole time there's this big FBI manhunt going on for this guy, and the FBI agents even say, we'll never be able to trace him through this internet stuff. He's too good. And who ends up actually capturing him isn't an FBI agent. He's actually another computer hacker. Now, this guy was a guy named Tutsumo Shimomura, also known as Shimmy, and he was like a cybersecurity expert. So he's what you call one of those, I guess, good guy hackers, And he decides to get involved with the FBI in the search for Mitnick because he was furious that Mitnick had hacked into his systems. Shimmy, he's like, screw this guy's a dick, I'm gonna bring him down. There was a little bit of a personal vendetta there. And basically this all starts when Shimmy and another hacker named Mark Lauder were working on a special project involving the OKI 900 cell phone. What they did was they reverse engineered it, and they were doing that same thing where they were changing the ESN via the keypad. Now, Mitnick, being in the hacker community, he naturally gets wind of this, and he decides, you know what, I'm gonna hack into Shimmy's personal home computer, his personal server, which is kind of something that, I don't know, it just sounds like something you don't do if you're a hacker. Yeah, hack into the big corporations, the dick FBI, whoever, but don't hack into some other hacker's personal computer. That just sounds like a dick move. So after Shimmy finds out that this guy is hacked into his personal computer and stole his personal files, Shimmy, he's all like, I'm gonna bring this guy down. And it wasn't long after this when police, armed with a search warrant, actually entered Kevin's home and they seized his electronics when he wasn't there. Now, the local cops, they weren't really there because they knew this was Mitnick and he was this notorious hacker. They were actually looking into this identity of this Brian Merrill guy. Something was off and things just didn't add up. However, it didn't take them too long for them to link up with the FBI and them to start sharing data with each other. And after this, he takes on another alias and he flees to Raleigh, North Carolina. And he actually hacks into, I think it was Portland State University, where he obtains another identity and he just takes off. Now, while he's living in North Carolina under this new identity, he actually makes a series of mistakes. So he contacts Motorola again, trying to get that compiler for that source code that he stole sometime back for that phone. And he essentially tells the guy that he's talking to that he needs it because this super hacker, his words, was going to try to steal it and he needed it as bait so the FBI can catch him. And the guy basically hands him over the compiler. However, his victory is short-lived because shortly after this, he wakes up one day, he realizes his phone has been shut off, and he was having an issue with the electrical company. They wanted him to pay a deposit and he was trying to get out of it. However, this all came down to the fact that the identity he was using was some kid in Portland or something, and the guy had said, hey, I think somebody's stolen my identity. And at this point, the feds, along with Shimmy, they were all closing in on him. And part of this was because those files that he had stolen from Shimmy, he had tried to store on this community forum called The Well, and it was taking up this huge chunk of data. At the time, it was 150 megabytes, but back then, that was a lot of data. So the guy who's kind of like the moderator of this forum or whatever is like, what's going on here? And he sees all these emails and stuff from Shimmy. He gets a hold of Shimmy and he's like, dude, I think I found a bunch of like your stolen files or whatever. And Shimmy, helping trying to catch this guy, he is given access to internet service providers and networks. And he starts noticing these patterns and he starts pinpointing exactly where Mitnick is. And they literally use like the Sprint network and cell phone towers, and they literally find out like right where Mitnick is. And Shimmy, all excited, he jumps on the first plane to Raleigh and he flies there. And at this point, they are completely tracking Mitnick through his cell phone and these cell calls and these cell towers. And all the calls Mitnick was making were being relayed to Shimmy and his team. And they're literally like camped out around his apartment building. So Mitnick gets home around midnight and he goes to log into his computer and he instantly notices that all the back doors to all the stuff he had access access to had mysteriously disappeared. And then all of a sudden, he had that sinking feeling that you get in your gut when you know something bad is about to happen. He looks out his apartment door into the corridor towards the parking lot, and he sees a U.S. Marshal just kind of out there in the parking lot. And just after 1:30 a.m., he gets a big old knock on his door. Mitnick's in there. Who is it? FBI, open up. I'm looking for Kevin Mitnick. I got a warrant for his arrest. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. I don't know any Kevin Mitnick. That sounds like a dumb name. Are you sure you have the right address? Do you know how to check freaking mailboxes? The Fed, he's like, don't play games with me. I know who you are. Come on, let's go down and get fingerprinted. Mitnick's like, okay, give me the address. I'll meet you there tomorrow. The fucking Fed, he's just like, nah, man, come on, let's go. I got you. That night, Mitnick was arrested, and he was immediately thrown into solitary confinement, and he had stayed in solitary confinement for a very long time because the judge and the prosecutor and everybody else were so afraid to give him any access to any of the digital evidence that was against him because they feared that he could, I don't know, unleash a virus and completely wipe it out or whatever. He was extremely restricted from computers, and the companies, they were pissed. They demanded $300 million in restitution for the theft of their source code. However, they were able to successfully argue that the damages were actually a lot less than that. It was basically the cost of the source code license, which was under $10,000. He was ultimately forced to pay something like $4,000. However, he was sentenced to jail time. He ended up pleading guilty to 7 counts, including wire fraud, computer fraud, possession of access devices, interception of data communications, and I guess a few other things. Probably identity theft. I would think that he's pretty much guilty of identity theft no matter what side of the aisle you're on. So he serves 5 years in prison. He was actually released on January 21st, 2000. And in an interview he gave shortly after getting out of prison, he walks into I don't know, it's like an electronics store, like a Radio Shack or something. And during that interview, he says, if I so much as touch this computer, I will go back to federal prison. Because part of his parole was he could not be around a computer. He could not touch them. He could not even think about them, I don't think. However, he does get somewhat of a redemption arc because a huge community of followers came out in support of him. And rightly so, because he never actually did anything malicious with anything that he ever copied or pirated or, quote, stole. He always maintained that he did this just out of intellectual curiosity and that he just wanted to learn. He was addicted to it. It was a rush. Of course, in the aftermath of all this, he becomes an advocate for computer security. He actually testifies in front of Congress that, it's not the firewalls and all this internal IT stuff, encryption that, really helps defend against computer hackers. He says you basically have to train your guys, your internal guys, your workers, because they're your weakest link. You need to train them on these social engineering techniques because they are really the ones who are the weakest link in the system. He was proof of that because he was considered and is still considered one of the world's greatest computer hackers. And most of what he did, he didn't even do from a computer. He did it through social engineering, that technique of gaining trust, making someone think that you are a high player or a key player in whatever industry you're trying to infiltrate, gaining that employee's trust and getting that employee to give you access to whatever you want. In my day job, I work in a financial company, and even though we're secured behind firewalls and all this other crap, the number one weakness for us is that telephone. And we get some new inexperienced teller or whatever on the floor who doesn't really know about this social manipulation. They're liable to hand out thousands of dollars without even thinking about it. Or they might give out some critical password or phone number or something that can give a hacker or somebody access to these systems that contain all this personal and financial information. It would be a disaster. And I think that's really the greatest lesson we get from Kevin Mitnick's story. It teaches us that humans are the weak link when it comes to all this stuff, because other, more malicious or intelligent humans will manipulate them. And as a whole, your company, your paycheck, whatever, it may suffer. So after he gets out of jail, he really spends the last 23 years of his life really kind of redeeming himself. He starts a cybersecurity kind of network. He gets married again. He has a kid. However, unfortunately, the world's greatest hacker couldn't beat cancer. He actually passed away of pancreatic cancer in 2023. But his story and his feats and what he did really did inspire a whole subculture of, I guess, computer hackers, IT nerds, whatever you want to call it. Some of his exploits were mentioned and repeated in film and television, and a lot of those tropes that we see in the hacker world really come from his story. And to be honest with his story, I really did gloss over a lot. There were some crazy misadventures that he went on that I didn't even mention here. But hey, read his biography. If I recall, it was called Ghost in the Wires or something like that. It's a really fascinating book where I got a lot of this information from. The guy is an absolute freaking legend. But speaking of legends and television, that actually leads us to our next kind of little subject or topic or sequence or whatever this is. Because now I'm going to switch gears to some television hacks in the 80s that are just kind of crazy and out there, and one still remains a mystery to this day. So next I'm going to talk really briefly about a man named Captain Midnight who hijacked the HBO signal. And then I'm going to get into the most infamous unsolved television hack of all time, the Max Headroom hack. And trust me, you don't want to miss this last segment. It is really awesome. So on April 27th, 1986, just a few months before I was born, an American electrical engineer by the name of John McDougal, also known as Captain Midnight, jammed the HBO satellite signal from the Galaxy 1 satellite in order to run like a 4-minute protest message against HBO for price gouging and basically cutting consumers of satellite systems out of the affordable market for, I guess you could call it, access to this television station. So as always with these stories, we got to start at the beginning because we need some context, right? So this really goes back to the 1970s when you start seeing these premium cable channels popping up on television. These are channels like HBO, Cinemax, later channels like Playboy, and those pay-per-view channels would come into prominence along with all the satellite channels we know today in those premium packages. And the key word there being premium, so obviously you have to pay for them. However, in the 70s and the 80s, when television was kind of going towards that satellite broadcasting, hobbyists, satellite enthusiasts, and hell, even hotels and stuff, they were able to aim their big giant satellites at Galaxy 1 and get these feeds from these channels for essentially free. And to be honest, at the time, this was not illegal. Because remember, nothing is illegal until the government steps in and passes a law making it illegal. So if you don't want to continue losing your rights, make sure those people that you're voting into power have your best interests at heart. But I digress. Now, for a while, it's not a big deal. The people who are watching this stuff over cable, they're already paying their fees. So it's not like these companies are losing money. However, with more people with satellite dishes accessing these channels for free, these companies started to basically scramble the signals. And in order for people who watch TV via satellite to access these channels now, they had to pay a subscription and buy a very expensive descrambler. So we're probably thinking, what, big deal, that's how companies make money, right? However, the monthly subscription fee that companies like HBO were charging were extortionate. They were literally price gouging, and if you're a satellite owner, you have to buy very expensive descrambler bots as well on top of that. So for context, when HBO began scrambling its signal on a 24-hour basis in 1986, it offered subscriptions to dish owners for $12.95 a month. And we gotta remember, this is 1986, so $12.95 a month is the equivalent to about $34 today. However, on top of that, they had to purchase one of these descrambler boxes, and those cost at the time $395, which was the equivalent to roughly $1,000 today. And this comes to really piss off people, especially in rural areas where they couldn't really get cable and satellite was their only option, because they're being told that they have to pay an extortionate rate and buy very expensive equipment just to access the same programming that somebody who has a cable box is only paying maybe like $5 or $6 a month for. And this caused a lot of protests. People were writing angry letters to their congressmen talking about how they're charging excessive fees, they're price gouging, they're cutting people out of the market. And it really hurt a lot of satellite dish dealers across the country. You know, when you went to buy a satellite dish, you went to a dealer who would sell you one. He'd come out, set it up for you, and then you'd be good to go. So a lot of these dealers were hurting bad, and their businesses were failing, and a lot of these businesses had to shutter because there was a mass reduction of sales going on. And one of these satellite dealers who owned his own small business installing and selling satellites was a man named John McDougal. And this was his living, this was his livelihood. And all of a sudden his business is failing, and he actually has to take a second part-time job working evenings just to make ends meet. So he takes his second job as an operations engineer at the Central Florida Teleport Uplink Station. And this is basically a TV station that kind of uplinks the signal to the satellites in the sky. So at the time, he's essentially working two jobs. He's got this job as this engineer, and he's also managing this failing satellite business. He's even quoted once during this experience saying, "I have been watching the great American dream slip from my grasp." So at the time, he's on edge and he's livid, so he starts writing protest letters to legislatures, and he actually spent a large amount of his own money to raise awareness about wanting to keep the market free from excessive charges of services. He's saying that these descrambler boxes are way overpriced and these subscription services are gouging their customers. And I kind of get it, because if I were a consumer at this time, I'd probably be pissed off too about these unaffordable packages. And to be honest, I wasn't born yet. This was all a few months before I was born. But how else would my poor father be able to watch George Carlin on HBO say shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits when he couldn't afford the goddamn extortionate fees for the package? So he gets an idea. He's going to jam the HBO signal in order to broadcast a message to protest these extortionate rates. So at 12:49 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 20th, a week before the Great Jamming, McDougal generates a color bar test pattern that was superimposed on HBO's signal for a brief period. And this was kind of like a test run, and since it happened at right around 1 a.m., nobody was watching HBO at the time, so HBO didn't even investigate it. So 6 days later, April 26, 1986, McDougal worked at his shop as normal and closed around 4 p.m. After eating dinner, he reported to the Central Florida Teleport for his shift with another engineer on duty. However, that other engineer was only there till 6 p.m. After 6 p.m., he basically has this whole TV broadcast station to himself. So he goes throughout his shift, and at the end of his shift, he decides, okay, this is time. So he sets up the color bar test pattern, and he uses a Quanta Corporation Microgem MG100 character generator to place letters on the television screen. So it's basically the color bar test pattern with a message written across it. And that message read as follows: "Good evening, HBO, from Captain Midnight. $12.95 a month? No way. Showtime and Movie Channel, beware." So he gets his message written down, and he swings the 30-foot or 9.1 meter satellite transmission dish into position and aims it at Galaxy 1. Galaxy 1 is the satellite that carries the HBO uplink or downlink. Whatever it is, it transmits HBO. It also carried Showtime and some other channels as well. And then at 12:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, during the beginning of the film The Falcon and the Snowman, which was premiering on HBO that night at 12:30 a.m., he overrides HBO's signal and he broadcasts that message for 4 minutes straight. So Hughes Communications, the owner of the Galaxy 1 satellite, which HBO was broadcasting on, immediately noticed this signal jamming, and they actually contacted HBO and threatened to shut down the signal if they couldn't regain control of this satellite, because they believed at the time that this was a domestic terrorist attack targeting satellite systems. So another HBO technician working out of New York, he's immediately contacted, and he says he has no idea where the signal jamming is coming from. So this technician, in an attempt to regain the signal, he increases the uplink transmission power from 125 watts to 2000 watts. So while this technician's doing this, McDougal, he's at this other uplink station in Florida, and he starts increasing the wattage in order to override that, and this lasts back and forth for 90 seconds in order to gain control. However, McDougal does eventually win, because the other technician, he's afraid to go any higher because he's afraid of damaging the satellite. However, at the end of this, this, McDougal, he ends the transmission and he just goes home for the day. He comes back in the next day and there is like chaos going on. The FCC is investigating, HBO is pissed off, and eventually the fucking feds get involved. And McDougal, he's like, well, what's going on? This is crazy. I have no idea. Like, somebody jammed our satellite signal? That is insane. However, McDougal does eventually get busted because while he's on a payphone sometime later, an unnamed accountant, anonymous rat, overhears him talking about the signal jamming, and they run to the fucking feds about it because, I don't know, people just can't mind their own business in the world. They act like they have some kind of civic duty to rat on people, which I don't really understand. Of course, the media gets a hold of this story and they run wild with it. They were like, oh my god, he could have hacked the CBS satellite, or he could have hacked like some military satellite, and you know how the modern media is. They just go on these wild tangents of what possibly could happen, as opposed to just reporting the news as it happens, and in the meantime losing the whole real story about how this was a protest against price gouging. But it's, as I said earlier, there's no integrity in media or journalism anymore. Modern journalism is nothing but ratings chasing and sensationalism, and every modern journalist is a goddamn hack who's in the pocket of some billionaire. However, the feds take this very seriously and they want their guy caught. However, after all this, he's eventually arrested. He plea bargains. He gets like a $5,000 fine and 1 year's probation, suspended or non-reporting, or however that works. He loses his ham operating license for a year, but he does become infamous for being the first person to ever interrupt a satellite signal broadcast in this manner. And later in life, he says that he still didn't regret doing it. However, the only thing he did regret was he didn't really get his message across. The whole thing was a protest against HBO and other companies charging excessive prices for their services. However, they get construed as the victims in all this. But this hack does lead to these networks eventually encrypting their data, and it's impossible to do today. However, you don't have to overpower a satellite dish signal in order to interrupt a broadcast. You can actually do it terrestrially here on the ground. And this leads to the most infamous TV hack in history, the Max Headroom transmission. Now, anybody who remembers the 80s, except me, I was a baby, will probably remember Max Headroom. He's the first computer-generated television host. So he's a character from this TV movie called, I think it's Max Headroom 20 Minutes into the Future. And he lives in this dystopian cyberpunk world where the TV corporations and the advertising agencies have kind of taken over everything. And during this film, there's this character named Carter, and he's involved in this motorcycle accident because he's investigating the corruption at one of these corporations or channels or whatever. So he's like a real journalist who has integrity and he's sticking it to the man. However, he's allowed to do what he does because the TV executives love him and he brings in ratings because, dystopian world where TV has control of everything. So he's being pursued through this parking garage, and he gets in this motorcycle accident and he's knocked unconscious. However, they can't let this really famous, really awesome investigative journalist die, so they upload his consciousness into an AI system, and his consciousness becomes Max Headroom, this edgy parody of basically any television host in the 80s. To the extreme. And it's kind of a great satire of those types of hosts and those types of personas from back then, those larger than life news anchors or whatever. And the TV movie goes on to spark this character who ends up, I think there's 2 TV series spin-offs in Britain and the US, and he becomes kind of an 80s icon. Hell, just type Max Headroom into YouTube and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So he's kind of the inspiration for this signal hijacking that happens in November of 1987. So on the night of November 22nd, 1987, the television signals of 2 stations in Chicago, Illinois were hijacked, and they sent out this pre-recorded pirate broadcast of an unidentified person wearing a Max Headroom mask and costume. So the first incident took place during the sports segment of independent TV station WGN TV's 9 p.m. newscast. It featured a person in a suit wearing a Max Headroom mask swaying erratically in front of a swiveling corrugated metal panel, which was kind of set up to mimic the blue screen background from the Max Headroom show. It had these geometric swirling patterns. Kind of typical 80s computer look. However, the only sound that was going on at the time was a loud buzz while this guy was just kind of swaying erratically back and forth in front of this swaying, spinning, corrugated panel. This first intrusion only lasts about 17 seconds before the WGN engineers were able to regain control of their broadcast signal. And when they get their signal back, the host kind of just plays it off and he's like, it looks like the computer that handles our uplink just took off and went wild. We don't know what the hell that was. So about 2 hours later that same night at around 11:20 p.m., the signal of the local PBS station, WTTW, was interrupted during an airing of the Doctor Who serial Horror of Fang Rock. And there was a lot of people watching this because Doctor Who was really big in America at the time. So the signal goes black again, and then once again there's Max Headroom standing in front of this corrugated metal swaying background. And this time he's talking, and he's talking through one of those ring modulators. So a ring modulator is just this electronic device that kind of distorts your voice. Now, the very first part of the tape is kind of cut off, but when he comes on, we can hear him making a comment about nerds, followed by Headroom calling WGN sportscaster Chuck Swirsky a freaking liberal. And nobody knows why he said this, called him a freaking liberal. Chuck Swirsky still doesn't know why to this day why he called him a freaking liberal, what kind of axe he had to grind with him. He then holds up a can of Pepsi, holds it to the camera and says, "Catch the wave," which was the Coca-Cola slogan for New Coke at the time. And the Max Headroom character was kind of a huge sponsor of New Coke, or at least they use it for advertising purposes, you know? The guy then flips off the camera with his middle finger inside what looks like a hollowed out dildo while singing the phrase, "Your love is fading." He then makes these series of quick comments and little sound snippets, and the audio is very distorted, so it's kind of hard to make out what he's saying. He then hums part of the theme song to the 1959 animated series Clutch Cargo, and at the end of that he says, "I still see the X," which was a reference to the last episode of that show. He then pretends to defecate while saying that I had made a masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds. This was a reference to WGN's call letters, which they would say world's greatest newspaper. So then there's a very crude video edit, and then the next thing we see is he's bent over, he's got his ass out, and there's this woman in this French maid costume, and she's in a mask too, so we have no idea who she is. And she starts smacking him on the ass with a fly swatter in this very like dominatrix fashion. At this point, he's screaming, no, they're coming to get me. Make it stop." And then the whole thing kind of fades out and Doctor Who comes back on. And this interruption lasted about 90 seconds. And there are thousands of recordings of this that you can go online and see. You can actually see it on Wikipedia. And the whole thing looks like some kind of weird avant-garde art project. And the thing is, even after countless FCC and FBI investigations, after countless people have theorized and analyzed this video and tried to figure out like where this guy came from, what his message was. Did he have an axe to grind with the broadcast network? Was he like a fired employee or something? Nobody knows to this day what the fuck this is or who did this. Nobody's ever come forward to say, yeah, I'm the infamous TV hacker Max Headroom. Now there are some people out there like me who think that this was kind of maybe like a hacking project or like an art project. I think it was someone's art, and I think this artist or these three artists, because you had like three people in this film, got together and thought, you know what, we're gonna do something that is just fucking off the wall and crazy, and we're gonna hijack a television broadcast network to do it. Because in my opinion, if you're an edgy artist, then yeah, that's the kind of art you want to make. And being a true artist and probably being a true anarchist, you know, they wanted to just give it out to the world, this mystery, for free, and they never took credit for it, which is, in my opinion, the sign of a true artist. Now, there are other theories that think that maybe these people were just computer hackers or broadcast network hackers who were looking to infiltrate this system, kind of like how phone phreakers used to do with the phones. They found something they could exploit and they exploited it. But to this day, the world just has no idea, and that's the coolest part about it, is that mystery is still unsolved. And let's not forget Max Headroom. He's kind of a symbol for protest. He's a symbol for sticking it to the man. He's an honest journalist in a time when journalism was becoming sensationalized and watered down, and he's a perfect parody of those journalists of that time. He's a big middle finger to the man, and I think at the end that was probably the whole thing. It's just a big middle finger to where America was at the time and how the values were being watered down and distorted into what it has become today. And I'll be honest, this subject has sent me down like a series of anarchist rants. I don't know why, I think I just get fired up when I see stories of people just sticking it to the status quo. It's probably why I love Diogenes so much. He was just the ultimate, like, fuck you to society. You know, step out of my sun and behold Plutarch's man. The only place to spit in a rich man's house is in his face, you know, that kind of attitude. These hackers, these phone phreakers, they all kind of embody that punk rock attitude of, don't tell me how this system's gonna work and how I should play in this system. I'm gonna do it on my own, and if you don't like it, that's too bad. You know, the attitude of, who are you to put your boot on my neck and your authority on me? Fuck you. And I just love it. I love how these stories kind of get me fired up and make me feel. To be honest, I had a blast recording this episode over the last, I think this is the 4th recording session of it. And I hope to do more episodes in the future that get me kind of fired up like this, because I just love it. But speaking of that future, the future of the show really hinges on you guys, you listeners out there, you people who are sharing the links, who are growing the community, especially you people who contribute to that link in the description of every episode, who contribute to the show monetarily. You guys are the best of the best. You guys are the primary reason why this show can still exist and can keep going into the future. And I truly thank you. So as always, check it out on the socials. Share my extremely low effort memes. I don't care. Go check them out. They're fun. Let's continue building this community and keep sending me ideas. I know I put a hiatus on people sending me ideas because I was flooded with them, but when I came across this one, it's a little off the wall, it's a little different, and I knew I had to dive down these rabbit holes and check it out, and I had a blast because this stuff really influenced, you know, IT and hacking culture, and yeah, we see that stuff in film and media, and we know it's all fake, but a lot of it was based on real stories, real life experiences. Like, for example, if you watch the 1990 film Hackers, I know a lot of people say it's a terrible film, but you see a lot of this, what I'm discussing in that film. It's really awesome. It's influenced entire genres. And hell, it even influenced this episode today. So I'm going to end it here. I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.